Welcome to Pod Junction, where business meets podcasting. Whether you're on a morning jog, driving to work, whipping up a meal, or just taking a moment for yourself, our weekly bite-sized episodes promise fresh insights from successful podcasters who have cracked the code of using podcasts to grow their business. So whether you're a podcasting newbie or seasoned podcaster, grab your notebooks and get ready.
Well, hello, welcome to Pod Junction. My name is Matt Edmondson. Beside me is the all-round good egg, talented professional to the end, ladies and gentlemen, podcast producer, Sadaf Bainon. Sadaf, how are we doing?
We're good. We're great.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Now, this is not related to growing your business with podcasting, but it's interesting that before we hit the record button, just tell the audience what your son said to you in response to your question.
Okay, so I asked my son yesterday, I said to him, how can I be a better mom to you? And his response, without missing a beat, was, can you shout less at me, please?
And did you shout at him for saying that?
No, because he's right.
Because he's right. Oh, well. Okay. That's maybe we should do a podcast on parenting.
Yes.
Maybe that's what it is. But this is what happens when we get ready to record the podcast. We just talk about all kinds of stuff to get the microphones set up. And so I couldn't help but make you share that story because that was very funny. So, yes, welcome to Pod Junction, where we talk about parenting and we talk about business. And how to use podcasting to grow your business. And the way we do this show, because it's still very, very new, I think we're on episode 4 now.
We are.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I can count without taking my shoes and socks off at the moment, which is important. So yeah, episode 4, what we do is we go and interview an expert, somebody who is using podcasting to grow their business in whatever form that looks like. We interview them. We ask them all kinds of questions. We then play you an excerpt from that interview in the show. And then Sadaf and I have a conversation about what that actually means for us as podcasters. And so, yeah, it's quite a fun little format. And you pick up parenting tips along the way, which is a beautiful thing. So that's what we're going to do. Today we have
the second part of Ben Shapiro. Thank you, Matt. And
for those of you listening, the reason why we're giggling is because I've just had to move Sadaf's microphone.
Again.
But that's okay. So we've got Ben Shapiro.
Yeah, part 2.
Is he talking about microphone technique?
I would benefit from that conversation. So we are talking about podcast topics and the interview process itself.
Okay, so we've got that with Ben Shapiro. Now, this is part 2 of our conversation with Ben. Part 1 was last week. If you haven't heard it, do check it out because Ben is an absolute legend. He is Martech. His podcast is Martech, right?
That is right, yeah.
Yeah, the Martech podcast. So here is Ben Shapiro from the Martech podcast talking about his tips and tricks on how to do podcasting well. So without further ado, we're going to play the clip. Then, like I said, straight after, Sadaf and I will be back to have a conversation about it. Here we go. It strikes me to do that. Again, I'm just trying to think about the practicalities of this. If let's say we were going to do that with this show, and I was going to say, right, Ben, I'm going to chop this up into 5 segments. I think what it means from my part is actually as the host, I have to be a bit more prepared as well. I have to understand, I suppose, how those 5 episodes are going to play out, or at least have some idea of what's going to happen in those, rather than just having a conversation and seeing where it evolves. Is that fair?
Yeah. Part of that is our onboarding process allows it. I actually do 0 prep before an interview. I have never done in years, haven't done scripted questions. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the people that are applying to be guests on our podcast get irritated. They're like, what are you going to ask me? And I'm going to say, no, it's a conversation. I haven't had the conversation. I don't know what the questions are yet. Here is our process that eliminates the amount of work that I have to do to basically prep for an interview. All of our guests come inbound. And so when they apply to be a speaker on our podcasts, A lot of that is because we have relationships with all the PR agencies. And so when somebody hires their PR agency and they're looking to talk about brand marketing, we've got a podcast for that. And so PR reps know I'm going to apply to one of I Hear Everything's podcasts. They fill out a form that gives us the person's name, company, LinkedIn, all their social profiles, but also we make them give the topics that they want to talk about.
Okay.
So I go through, and we've got an algorithm that basically ranks people by how prominent of a speaker they are, how big their social signals are, or do they have a good domain rank? How big is their email list? And so we get a sense of kind of like how big of a speaker or how much they can help us share the content is. And then we look at the topics as well. So, if the CEO of Salesforce, Mark Benioff, comes in and he says, I want to talk about sales and force, that's not a great topic, but I can recognize that he is a potentially huge speaker. And so then I would write topics that I wanted to talk to him about.
Right.
Most of the time what's happening is somebody is writing 2 sentences about what they want to talk about, and I'm converting those into 5 or 6 word podcast titles. I am then in control of what the topics and titles are, so I know that they're going to be in my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
My team goes and writes an interview script. Hey, today we're going to talk to Matt about e-commerce and podcasting. Here's my first conversation with Matt. And tomorrow we're going to talk about podcasting outside of e-commerce. When I sit down, I read that interview, it has the topic that I've already sort of pre-approved. And really what I'm doing is I'm using that topic as a conversation starter. Matt, we are going to talk about podcasting in e-commerce. You are an e-commerce podcast host. Tell me why you decided to start a podcast for e-commerce. It's your turn. Now you talk, and I'm starting at the high level on that one specific topic, and all I have to do is read and react. And so you're going to go off and give me a 5-minute monologue, and my strategy is I'm going to summarize what you say to make sure we're on the same page, and I'm going to try to ask you a natural follow-up to that question. So I don't have to have 5 questions written out for you because I'm reading and reacting what you say is important about the topic that you're an expert on. That's why I don't have to prep.
Yeah. That's really powerful. And so you by saying no prep, do you do the pre-call thing, or is it just literally the first time you meet the guest is when you're hitting the record button for the podcast?
You were on my podcast. It's been months now, right? Prior to you coming on the show and being my guest, I had looked at your name, title, company, said, this guy seems credible. He's got a decent audience, and I like these topics. That was as much as I knew about you before the conversation was going to happen.
Right.
Because my job as the podcast host is not to be the expert. In the interview style, my job is to provide a comfortable environment where the expert can tell me the information about the topic that we're talking about. So I'm the host, I'm not the guest. I don't have to be the world's biggest wizard in MarTech, which allowed me to be the MarTech podcast host and the Voices of Search podcast host and a brand marketing guest host and a I don't work in RevOps, but I can host those episodes because I know enough about the topic to just be able to ask a couple of questions that will get the experts talking about their field. So, I think that people confuse the role of the host and the guest often when they're thinking about building a podcast. And really what you need is somebody who is friendly, somebody who is a good conversationalist, not somebody who's the most knowledgeable about a subject matter.
If you're intrigued and want to dive deeper into this conversation, check out Pod Junction Cohort, where you can listen to the complete interview and much more. Simply visit thepodjunction.com for more information about how to join.
So welcome back. That was Ben talking about his process. Now, in the first video, he talked about how he took his hour-long show, didn't he? And he chopped it down into smaller shows. So he does 5 daily shows now rather than one long weekly show. And so I started off this segment by saying that, does that take more prep? And he's like, yeah, no, not really. And that's the summary of Ben's. Does it take more practice? No, not really. But what's insightful is how he does his interview process, right? And not everybody's interview process is the same. And I think you have to find something that works for you. But what I really liked about Ben's process, and what really just is music to my ears, if I'm honest with you, is zero prep. Because I'm a lot like Ben in that sense. I'm the kind of guy that when I do interview people, I often like to wing it. I appreciate that's probably not the right phrase, but I often like to not know anything, so that whenever I know something, when I discover anything, it's a reaction, genuine. It's a surprise in the moment. I do usually know some basic details because you're very kind and write some basic information on the AMP system that we use. But yeah, zero prep. Could you do an interview with zero prep?
I would like to. I would like to be able to, but I'm just starting out on this journey, so I think I could do with some prep.
Yeah. That's a really important point, actually. That a lot of this comes down to confidence. And excuse me while I get comfortable on my chair. So a lot of this comes down to confidence, but also down to, I guess, how used to this whole process you are, right? So Ben has done hundreds of podcasts. I've done a few. I don't know if I've done as many as Ben, but I've definitely done a few. And I suppose I feel a lot more comfortable and confident in it now than I used to. And what Ben said was interesting, wasn't it? About knowing enough. He's not the expert, but he knows enough to ask interesting questions.
Yeah, that was music to my ears.
Why would you say that?
Well, because as he said, I don't have to be an expert in it when I'm the host of a show. I have to be a good conversationalist, as he said. I have to be friendly, as he said, but also guide the conversation and ask, give them this right space to be able to share their expertise.
Yeah, super wise, isn't it? And I think that's one of the critical things about being able to interview well, isn't it? Just give them the space to demonstrate and share their expertise. And I think feeling confident in that. One of the things that I do, which helps me, because I take copious notes whenever I'm listening to somebody. So if you watch one of my podcasts, I'm looking at my notes. I've got my notes here. These are all my notes from Ben's conversation. I like to take notes. I like to highlight things. Just as they're talking, I might jot down a question, or I might circle something they said that I want to come back to, just so I can riff off of that. I think that's especially in the longer interviews, because if it's a shorter interview, people know to talk for 10, 20 seconds. If it's a longer interview, they can talk for minutes.
Yeah.
And so, keeping focused and keeping track on that is quite an interesting thing, isn't it? Yeah. No, very good. Very good, Ben. I enjoyed that. So what else did you get from Ben's chat or Ben's interview?
I found it interesting that his onboarding process is actually quite robust.
I thought you'd pick up on this.
Because I guess that's kind of where I've been involved.
Yeah.
And I guess that sets him up then for the zero prep, which seems to work out well for him. And it's a nice balance.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So the guests that we have on our podcast now, so you take something like EP or Push or whatever, the guests that we have, I was talking to Matthew Brackett yesterday, who was on the Push podcast. What a legend that guy was. Do check out that episode, by the way. I don't know when it's going to come out because we were so far in front of ourselves. But that episode with Matthew Brackett was really great. He applied to be on Push.
Yeah.
And he was recommended to us by Noemi from Podcast Connections, who's awesome. If you're looking for a podcast agency, check them out because she's great. And so we know that when Noemi recommends somebody to us, on the whole, they're going to be a good guest, right?
Yeah.
And that whole process of choosing a good guest makes the interview so much easier.
It does.
Because in the early days of EP, we didn't do that very well. And so some of the conversations were like pulling teeth a little bit, weren't they? Jim, I mean,
I know.
we can all choose them in our heads. Like, okay. And so it's a really important point to make the interview easy, have the right guests on the show. And if your show's at a place like Ben's where all of his guests are inbound, did you hear that?
Yeah.
It's a bit like EP, to be fair. I've not had to go and ask anybody. Occasionally I'll ask people to come on the show that I meet because I think that'll be interesting. But most of the people that come on the show have applied to be on the show. And so your podcasts do get to these points. If you're just starting out, trust me, they do get to a point where people apply to be on your show. But it's fascinating that all of his clients are inbound. He has this robust policy, and then that makes the interview an awful lot easier because he's chosen he's sort of filtered out quite well, hasn't he? Which is, I mean, I have a Bane on who filters the guests, which is just as a beautiful thing, filtering guests out quite well. So we should do an episode on how to choose the right guest. But I mean, what are some of the things that you have learned about choosing the right guest?
I think some of the top things that I have learned is it's not when they're on a podcast, it's not enough to just know to be an expert in a certain part of the field. It's being able to talk about it as well and almost to teach it, because you're talking to an audience that is interested, may not understand all the nitty gritty of it, but they want to learn. So to be able to actually talk about it in that way, I think is really important. Otherwise, they're just talking.
That's very true. Very, very true. And I think, again, part of our role as interviewers, if you're doing the interview style podcast, if you're not doing the interview style podcast, this may be not of any interest to you whatsoever. But I think part of our role is when we're doing the interview, and you'll find this when you're interviewing people, is you're constantly thinking, and Danielle mentioned this, didn't she? You're constantly thinking of who your listener is. And so as people are talking, you're asking questions, hopefully, that are interesting to your listener. What kind of things would they be asking right now? And so like on something like e-commerce podcast, you can have somebody come on who talks at such a high level of expertise that actually I say to all our guests before they come on the show, you may think that I'm actually stupid by some of the questions that I'm going to ask you. And it's not me being stupid. It's just me going, there are times when I think you need to explain that to someone who is just starting out, who doesn't understand the lingo, who doesn't understand, hasn't got that whole educational type thing. And I think that's very much on you as the interviewer to ask those questions. But you're right, to be able to answer those questions well, your guest has to be able to teach them as if they're teaching them to not a young child, but do you know what I mean? Someone who's a lot younger, or someone who's new to it. And I think if they can and do that in an interesting way, they always make interesting guests.
Yeah.
Is that your experience?
It becomes memorable as well.
Yeah. It does. And I think we've had much better guests as a result, haven't we? Yeah. What do you think to this idea that all his guests are inbound?
I think it's great. Yes, I think it's great, especially from a perspective of producing the show and making sure you've got content lined up that's actually going to be interesting for the listeners, and also kind of carry the message that we're carrying as a podcast. Absolutely. So his process, which I thought was interesting. So he jots down 5 to 6 word titles as they're talking. He's coming up with podcast title ideas. I used to do that. I tend not to do that anymore. We tend to let AI choose titles, don't we? We're very reliant on AI in a lot of those things, just because I don't think that's my skill set, that's for sure. And then he talked about how he starts off the conversation at a high level, like how did you get involved in e-commerce? It's just an opening question, and perhaps we should talk about this in another. All these ideas, the power of the opening question, the opening question being the really important one, which just gets the conversation started. Yeah.
And so in e-commerce podcast, I tend to ask people whereabouts in the world they are or what is it they do, and it just gets the guest feeling a bit comfortable. On push, my favorite question is, if you could have a podcast and you could have anybody on as a guest to interview, someone that has impacted your life, past or present, who would be a guest on the show and why. And it's just fascinating. So Matthew, when I was talking to him yesterday, he was like, I'd have my mum and dad on because both his parents have passed away. And he's like, I've got a lot of questions I'd like to ask them and record. But then he also talked about getting a dictator on. He said, someone like Hitler, he said, not because I think he was right, but, the man was a lunatic, but I just have lots of questions. And so it just starts a whole conversation. Mario, who I did a podcast with yesterday, Mario Lanzarotti, or Lanzarotti. I need to get that Italian accent. He was talking about how he wanted to have on the podcast Tony Robbins, which he's quite a popular answer, the motivational speaker, and Jesus. Okay. A pairing that I wasn't expecting. I'm not going to lie. And so it's like, well, this is really interesting. And so that just starts a whole fascinating conversation. And so Ben, he asks a high level question. And then I like this trick, and I do this sometimes. I don't do it all the time, but he summarizes.
Yeah.
So when they respond, they give the answer. He tries to summarize the key points from that answer to make sure he's understood it. That's actually very good parenting. I mean, going back to the parenting top tips with our kids. Let me just repeat back what I think I've heard before I totally lose my cool. So summarize, and then what's the natural follow-on question from that? I thought was a really... Start with something high level, something easy, something that gets people talking, something that sparks a conversation in the right way for you and your show. Summarize some of the key points, and then ask a really interesting follow-on question that makes the expert because you don't have to be as the interviewer. I thought it was really insightful stuff from Ben. Is there anything else you got from them?
He didn't really say this, but reading between the lines, I think all of what he does actually also puts the guest at ease to the point where they're not like thinking that they're even on camera. And I think that's a really nice place for the guest to be and for the host to get them to that point, because it makes the conversation for the listener so much more valuable. It does. And that actually, I think, happens a lot off camera. So when a guest comes, and this is why, Ben doesn't do the pre-calls, but we like the pre-calls because people feel like they know what's going on a little bit more, especially for a podcast like Push, where a lot of the guests are not podcast experts. Whereas EP, it's maybe not as important, although it does help us filter. But it's one of those where in those few minutes before you hit the record button, that small talk, hey, how you doing? Whereabouts in the world are you? My aim in those few minutes before I hit the record button is to always make my guests laugh. In whatever means I feel is appropriate at that point. It's not like a conscious thing anymore in my head, but I know I can hit the record button once I've gotten to smile and laugh, because they're just starting to feel a little bit more at ease. And then they forget the camera's on. A bit like we do. We just get chatting away. And before don't know where to look.
Don't know where to look. Should I look at that camera there? Should I look at that camera? I just don't know. Professional microphone techniques. So no, great conversation from Ben. Enjoyed that. The full interview with Ben. Tell people about the full interview with Ben.
The full interview with Ben.
The complete.
The complete.
Nothing missing, nothing broken.
Yes. Can be found on, what's our website?
Podjunction.com.
Podjunction.com. You heard it right here.
The podjunction.com, ladies and gentlemen, is our website. Like I say, totally professional, state of the art. Yes.
Yes. So go visit the website, and you can have access to that there.
Well, you have to join the podcast cohort to do that. But yes, the full interview. This is the reason why you should join the Podcast Junction cohort. You get to hear all the interview. We played lots of snippets on the show. We've got some more great snippets from Ben coming up, I have no doubt. But yeah, if you want to hear the full interview now, go to thepodjunction.com. You'll find the cohort information there. You can hear the whole thing in its entirety. Lots of notes you will take from that. What's coming up next week?
So next week we're having Tim Richardson from Your Basket is Empty podcast.
He's such a legend, Tim. You're going to enjoy this one. Yeah.
And he's going to be talking about sponsorship. So the role of sponsorship in podcasts.
Very good. So if you want people to come sponsor your podcast episodes, make sure you check out our conversation with Tim next week. You are not going to want to miss that. So make sure you do all this stuff, like, subscribe, all those kind of things that you know to do. And yeah, check out thepodjunction.com. Come join us over there. And anything else?
No.
Or is that it?
That is it.
Awesome. Have a fantastic week, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode at Pod Junction, where business meets podcasting. If you enjoyed the insights from today and wish to hear the full conversation with today's special guest, don't forget to visit thepodjunction.com, where you'll find more information about how you can join today. Whether you listened while on the go or in a quiet moment, thank you for letting us be a part of your day. Remember, every episode is a chance to gain insights and to transform your business with podcasting. So keep tuning in, keep learning, and until next time, happy podcasting.